Good evening, everyone. If I can have your attention, thank you very, very much for coming in kind of the busiest part of the term. It's a huge pleasure to welcome this evening Professor Michael Puett from Harvard University, who's the Walter C. Klein Professor there, history of Chinese history and anthropology, as well as the chair of the Committee for the Study of Religion. And he's very well known, of course, for his work thinking about China and trying to bring China back into the mainstream in Western thought and make it as relevant as he would argue, I think, it always has been and always should be. But he's also, you may have come to your attention through books that are aimed at the wider audience, such as The Path, which kind of, if you Google his name, a Guardian article comes up. He gave an interview to a Guardian reporter in King's Cross and Pancras Station, I believe, in 2017, where he was talking about how to live your life according to Confucian values and how to, as a result, change your life for the better. And this was based on one of the classes that he gives at Harvard, which is still the third most popular class at Harvard. And that doesn't sound like, it sounds pretty amazing, but then you realize what's number one and number two, and this says, I think, a lot about Harvard students. It's the introduction to economics and the introduction to computer science, and then after that, it's how to change your life with Confucius. Delivered by Michael in his own inimitable style. Now, this is a man who never uses PowerPoint slides. Right, so there's nowhere to hide. It's just what he's got to give for the table. We have locked the doors, so you can't leave. And he's promised maximum 7 hours of a Confucian kind of training for us all. And given that kind of famously in the Analects, one of the doorkeepers who's asked, "Have you seen that chap Confucius?" he replies, "Isn't that the guy who just keeps failing but keeps on trying anyway?" We can hope for a fantastic lecture, no doubt, this evening from Michael. So I will leave you in his capable hands with the title, "What's the Point of Cultural Comparison?" Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for the much too nice introduction, but very deeply appreciated. And thank you all so much here at Warwick for all that you are doing. First, obviously, for inviting me, that I deeply appreciate, but thank you for all you're doing in a larger sense. Warwick, in many ways, epitomizes what I will be talking about tonight, which is really a university, and particularly in this case a center, devoted to saying what happens if we begin thinking globally and comparatively across the board, and the answer, as you were discovering in practice, is, well, everything changes. So in part, what I'll be speaking about tonight is to underline the significance of what you are doing at a larger level. So my deep thanks to all of you for all that you're doing, and more immediately for being here tonight. So let me begin my talk with a standard narrative that underlies, I will argue, many common conceptions about the world today. That narrative goes along the following lines. We humans used to live in something called a traditional world. A traditional world in which we were born into certain social positions and social roles that we then had to perform. A traditional society that would also define by birth as well what we would do in our lives, both in terms of our social position and how we would actually live our lives. A traditional world that would also give us a belief system that we were sort of socialized into accepting as simply reality. And because humans were born into such a realm that defined for them their social role, that defined for them their place in the world, that defined for them their even understanding of the universe, these traditional societies tended to be, by definition, extremely local. They were connected only to the immediate surroundings, controlled usually by those who happened to be born into high positions, namely the high aristocrats, and these traditional societies were small, local, unconnected, and sadly, humans somehow lived in such societies, well, for kind of millennia, and that defined us. Now, luckily for us, some things were changing along those lines, so new technologies were developed. So we learned things like agriculture, we learned things like metallurgy, we learned basic things, basic technologies that raised our standard of living, but still we were stuck in such societies until began what we like to call the modern age, when finally, for the first time in all of human history, all of this changed. Finally, for the first time in human history, humans were actually capable of rethinking the world around them because they were given the opportunity when they were born to see themselves as individuals who could decide for themselves what to do with their lives, who could decide for themselves what role they want to play in the world, who out of their own efforts could actually gain social positions depending upon how much effort they put into it. They began for the first time to be able to decide for themselves what to believe and to question traditional assumptions. They began to build entire political worlds that would depend on what they as humans thought best. That modern world, luckily for humanity, began sometime, beginning 17th, 18th centuries. I'll come back to that. But, of course, the key is the 19th and 20th centuries when this flourishes. Immediately, of course, leading to some difficulties because once humans have the ability, finally, for the first time, to decide for themselves how to live, they disagree. So you get different ideas as to how to do this. Different isms begin emerging. So communism, fascism, capitalism. People begin debating and eventually fighting actual wars between these different isms. But even through that horror, the good news was we were modern, we can decide for ourselves how to live, and even more immediately for us, sort of well into this modern period, the wars seem to be receding, and there seems to be largely a consensus as to the proper way to live, namely liberal democracy and capitalism, and finally, a full flourishing of capitalism with all the great benefits that come from it become possible. And luckily for us as well, being in this modern period, we, now looking at us as people in a university, we can actually try to understand all that I just mentioned because we're all trained in disciplines that emerged during this modern period by definition, right? During the period when we can begin finally thinking about the world. So in the 19th century, as all that I just mentioned is occurring, we begin creating the academic disciplines that still very much define the university today. And those disciplines, especially those in the social sciences and humanities, across the board are based in, take for granted, the narrative that I just mentioned, right? These are modern disciplines thinking about the world around them. And some of those disciplines take that narrative for granted. Some explicitly debate aspects of the narrative. So to give an obvious example, one of the key questions in historical sociology, in history, in economic history in particular, is what caused the emergence of this modern period? So was it the rise of a middle class? Was it the emergence of Protestantism? Huge debates about what really drove it. So the narrative is obviously right. The question is, what created this? And implicitly, therefore, how do we maintain it? So luckily for us, we live in this modern world. And luckily for us, more immediately, we're in a university where we have disciplines, again, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, that take for granted and are embedded in that modern project. Isn't that great? Now, as is probably obvious from the tone of voice I've been using, I'm going to be arguing tonight that literally every single thing I just said is wrong, minus the little part about the disciplines. That's right, but if everything else is wrong, we kind of need to rethink our disciplines too. So let me just go through each of these very briefly. Did we ever live in a traditional world? Well, by the definitions that I was using before, the answer is, of course, repeatedly. But did humans live in such traditional worlds before something we can call the modern period? I would argue absolutely not. Empirically, that is simply wrong. And in fact, even the terms I was using, you can find numerous places throughout world history where you get self-conscious attempts to question worlds in which things like that would happen. and very self-conscious debates about how humans could create worlds where things like that don't happen. That is not a 19th and 20th century Euro-American concern exclusively. That has been a constant concern throughout world history. Moreover, in that modernity narrative, the claim, of course, is, for whatever reason hotly debated, the modern world begins at some time in what is now called the early modern period in Europe, and by the 19th and 20th centuries, and now 21st centuries, hits full fluorescence. Is this right? Well, I'm not surprisingly going to answer no, but I'm going to answer no in a specific sense. The specific sense being the following. Did this happen? Well, it happened in the obvious sense that the theories based upon it emerged, by which I mean in the 19th century in Europe, it was absolutely true that theorists were seeing themselves having emerged from an 18th century in Europe where all positions of power were defined exclusively by birth, where there was almost no social mobility, where there were indeed attempts to develop religious beliefs that would hopefully be accepted by larger parts of the population. They failed, but I mean, that was certainly an overt goal. And without any question, in the 19th century, you are for the first time getting the beginnings of attempts to break that down, out of which come all of these grand theories of tradition and modernity. So did it happen? Well, locally it happened in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, but it's happened repeatedly. Let me just give you a non-random example that I will be coming back to a little bit more. So in 221 BCE, in China, a figure, self-proclaimed the first emperor of China, creates a new world. He breaks down what is explicitly labeled as a traditional order in which humans were defined by feudal worlds that gave them what they were supposed to do and told them what to think. The first emperor explicitly proclaims he is creating a new world, breaking from the past completely, destroying the past. That new world, indeed, is such a radical new beginning that nothing from the past should ever be considered as something we can learn from. You look at the past to see, sadly, how they used to live, but by definition, it is not something that we can learn from. And this new world is going to begin a new era called, and it's a very nice translation of the Chinese term, the modern period, literally. And with this modern period, since it's a new era, that new era will continue. The books from the previous era, the traditional era, should be burned because otherwise we might foolishly think we can learn from them, and we might actually return to these foolish, dangerous ideas. And therefore, once we burn them, once we realize the past is past, we can then finally create a modern world. 221 BCE. Now, we, of course, can laugh at the grand claims made by the first emperor. As you probably know, his empire didn't even make it 20 years, so no, it did not create a grand new empire for the rest of the world. But what I would like to note is how chillingly similar a lot of his claims are to those that we typically make. Note, first of all, when we make these claims that humans before the modern period lived in traditional societies, no, we aren't burning the books. In fact, we have disciplines where we train people to read those books. But we kind of are burning the books in the sense of burning the knowledge, because one of the basic implications of our modernity narratives is that by definition, we cannot learn anything from those societies that we label as traditional. They're fascinating, they're intriguing, but by definition, we can't learn anything from them because they're part and parcel of a world that in our own narrative, we by definition would never want to live in. Moreover, within our narratives, by definition as well, anything good that can emerge from the world, by definition as well, is only going to be part and parcel of this modern world. In other words, things that have arisen within it, things that we will continue to create within it going forward. And so the modernity project is seen as an endless project going forward. By definition, it's a total break from the past. And when we organize our disciplines assuming that narrative, we organize it the same way. When was the last time you took an economics course, I suspect most of you have done so, in which economic theories from around the world were discussed as theories? The answer, needless to say, is never, because there weren't theories in traditional societies, would go the assumption. That's empirically wrong. There were intensely powerful economic theories developed throughout world history. You will never hear about them in an economics class, by definition. No, we don't burn the books, but we de facto do the same. We burn that knowledge. When was the last time in a discussion of politics that you were introduced to political theories from around the world, from so-called traditional societies? The answer, of course, is never. Now, you might read about political theories from around the world, from so-called traditional societies, but you would by definition read about them in a course about traditional theories of politics back then in culture X, Y, or Z. By definition, in other words, you're not going to take them seriously as theories that you would try to wrestle with. And I would expand the point. You would not take any body of knowledge that you could take seriously from any traditional society, period. Ever. Ever. Now, I can think of one exception, but it's an exception that proves the rule. It is true in a philosophy department, you might have, for example, a reading of Aristotle, where Aristotelian ethics would be taken seriously. But no, it's a telling example. It would be taken seriously because you take out most of what Aristotle says. You take out the minor fact that Aristotle supported slavery. He thought people were, at birth, radically different people. So he's talking about one tiny group of well-born people. You take that out and you rework it into a modern conception, and that makes it palatable and acceptable. But if you're going to read the rest of Aristotle, it would never be in a philosophy class. It would by definition be in a classics class where you're learning about ancient Greece. It would never be an attempt to actually say, let's wrestle with these ideas, including ideas that we might find deeply abhorrent. In this case, ideas that actually would, in fact, meet many of our qualifications of a traditional way of thinking. But there's a further point I want to make as well, which is that if many of our disciplines are replicating what we see the first emperor saying when he's going to burn books in China, there's another side to this too, which is, why is he claiming this to be a modern period? And why do we see these parallels? The answer to this, I think, is kind of clear from his own position, and this is another reason I wanted to bring up the example. It's the height of empire. That's why he's saying it. And in fact, even when the empire that he's trying to create falls very soon thereafter, it's followed by another empire, which replicates the same set of arguments. Because there the sense is, okay, the first emperor failed, but we will finally build an empire that will accomplish everything that he's accomplished. And you get arguments that strike us as amazingly modern. You get people explicitly making end-of-history arguments that sound exactly like Francis Fukuyama, literally saying things like, we are finally bringing an end to history because previous history consisted of first traditional societies, then the birth of a modern period when we began to, for the first time, understand how to create the world according to what is best for us. And now we are bringing that to an end because the wars are over, and we have finally come up with a final synthesis that perfectly pulls together how we should live our lives. Francis Fukuyama called that democratic liberal capitalism. Obviously, in the Han Dynasty, it wasn't given that name, but it's basically the same structure, an end of history argument, by which I mean the following. What if we were to consider as a possibility that the narrative that underlies our common conceptions of the world around us, that underlies all of the social science and humanities disciplines, what if all of them are simply byproducts, by is probably too weak a word, direct products of an imperial era? That's all they are. What if the reason that these emerged in the 19th century is because it's the height of the European imperial period? And they accepted these imperial visions, it built them into these grand narratives of modernity, and not surprisingly, flawlessly are paralleled by exactly comparable attempts made at other moments of self-perceived heights of empire, including in ancient China. And if there is even a possibility that there might be something to this, the implications are rather chilling, which is that we have built a body of theory that takes for granted an imperial vision of history that I think it's safe to say no one in this room would remotely want to support. And yet, what if our bodies of theory replicate it perfectly? That's a rather chilling vision. It is a rather chilling vision to say that basically we have a body of knowledge that takes for granted an imperial vision of history with all of the horrible repercussions that that entails, all the while being perceived as the basis of true knowledge. Now, I want to immediately make clear, and this will become clear as I get to the end of my talk, this is not to say we should jettison our disciplines across the board. Of course not. It is to say we should be aware that we are buying into assumptions based upon very typical standard visions that arise at the height of an empire, and we fail to see these because they are so embedded in the ways we have built our disciplines. If, again, there is any possibility there is anything to this, and I think there is a bit of a possibility there is something to this, it means we have an ethical problem on our hands. It also means, luckily for us, a rare moment when I say that without irony, when actually the possible solutions are there embedded in that very stuff that we have put down as the objects of our analysis, particularly the objects of our analysis as so-called traditional societies, in which nothing changed because people were born into worlds that told them what to do. So, what I would like to turn to next is how we could begin to rethink our disciplines if we were to be aware of the dangers I have just fallen into. And my solutions are going to be several-fold, but let me just begin with the most obvious because it's been an undercurrent of everything I've said so far. The first is a very simple and straightforward one. Let's go back to the first emperor. If, obviously, what he is giving is simply legitimation of an empire, and if obviously none of us would accept that as reasonable, why would we burn books for them that happened to be written before 221 BCE? And if we're kind of doing the equivalent when, again, if we don't burn the books, but we don't, by definition, take seriously ideas that arose outside of Euro-America in the 19th and 20th centuries, what happens if we do? What happens if we were to admit the possibility that humans throughout history have been wrestling in incredibly complex ways with what to do with the world, how to build worlds successfully, oftentimes doing them outside of the assumptions of the rational, self-interested individual that so undergirds our own modernity narratives, but doing so through very different questions, very different terms, but often very similar problematics of issues they're trying to wrestle with. And what happens if, taking away the claim that this is all part of a traditional world, and reading them as theory, what would that change? Well, it changes kind of everything. Going back to that example of the economics class, imagine in that economics class, you aren't simply reading rational choice theory and behavioral economics, the two competing economic theories of the day, but you are reading economic theory from around the world as theory. You would be looking at the ways that humans have been wrestling with these issues for millennia. Not, again, assuming, or not only assuming, you'll see this idea popping up over and over again of the rational, self-interested individual, but a lot of the theories are against that vision. And you have actual government policies based upon very different conceptions of how humans operate. And you actually have many of these put into practice, and you can see the implications of putting in this vision, its strengths, its dangerous weaknesses, and counter attempts and attempts to change this. And suddenly, instead of looking at economics of the past 2 centuries in Euro-America as the only possible area of theory and the only possible area to be concerned with because it's the modern period, suddenly you open up a tapestry of attempts throughout world history to wrestle with these issues. The same with political theory, the same with ethical theory, the same, indeed, I would argue strongly, with all of the theories that we talk about. To give another example, literary theory. You have, to return to my example of China, extraordinary theories of literature, some of which directly parallel, ones that we know very well, many of which fundamentally run against it. Imagine a class where you are learning literary theory, and you're learning literary theory from the Semitic and Sanskrit world as theory as well. It will fundamentally challenge many of your most basic assumptions of how to read, of how to think about reading, the ethics of different ways of reading. It fundamentally challenges everything. Now note again, in none of these cases are you getting rid of, I'll now use the scare quotes, modern Western theory, but you are saying that's one very powerful body of theory into which you're going to work other bodies of theory, and you're going to try to work out the implications, including with an historical tapestry where these have been put into play. And then imagine that other discipline that I alluded to before. The discipline of history or historical sociology, in other words, all the disciplines that are based in the study of the rise of modernity. Let's note how that one changes. So, if you start looking, in terms of the issues I've been mentioning, at the historical record, outside of a tradition-modernity distinction, or narrative, I should say, what you begin to notice, and I would say notice because it's there, we're simply failing to see it or refusing to see it because of our narratives, what you begin to see is that the entire modernity narrative is nothing but, sorry for the extreme statement I'm about to make, but feel free to challenge me, nothing but an imperial claim. Nothing but an imperial claim. That, as we've seen, has arisen repeatedly. And what I mean by that is as follows. History has always been global. Always. Anything that happens in the world can only be, I'm again sorry for making these grand overstatements, but I think they're true, can only be understood when being put into a larger context. Only. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, wonderful books, and truly wonderful, I don't mean this as a criticism of the books themselves, wonderful books have been written about the rise of the novel. Wonderful books, brilliant, brilliant. But they would be fundamentally changed as arguments when they're trying to explain why the novel arose if the authors had actually understood that actually the novel arises across Eurasia at roughly the same time. It means that some of those instances of why it arose in Europe, when they're paralleled, it raises the question of, oh, okay, what is going on? And if they're not paralleled, it raises the question of, well, is this a serious issue or not? And if it is, what are the implications of that? In other words, when we're trying to put together a schema of causality, What is significant? What is less significant? What leads to a permutation of a common theme? What turns into a completely different direction? And let's now expand the examples. Think of what we think of as the major trajectories in our grand global histories, which again tend to be exclusively based upon a 19th century vision of European history. Everything changes when they're posed globally. So, the rise of empire that we mentioned in 221 BCE. Well, since I gave the China example, I'm sure you all immediately realize, whoa, that's not just happening in China. No, it's a pan-Eurasian phenomenon, roughly the same time. Why? And then you start expanding it. Now, these examples, luckily again, are being studied in detail here at Warwick. Indeed, we have some of the key scholars who are doing the best work on precisely these issues. And this is the future of not just the historical profession, but all professions that deal with historical questions. Which isn't to say that everyone who's going to do history needs across the board to be learning 5,000 languages. It does mean, however, that just as I'm talking about the theories of economic theory, political theory, etc., we need to be thinking the same way in history. And part of the key for doing all of this, since most of us are not going to learn 5,000 languages, is we in the social sciences and humanities desperately need to start working collaboratively. Desperately. So I happen to study China. I therefore have learned languages that have been important in the eastern end of Eurasia. I've never, for example, studied Sanskrit. I've never studied any of the multiple languages throughout Eurasia, indeed, except on the far end of eastern Eurasia and the far end of western Eurasia. But a lot of people have. Imagine if we started organizing collaborative teams that actually began looking at what is going on across all of Eurasia, in which you see different permutations of common themes happening all literally, throughout that entire history. And note, getting back to the key point I began with, how completely different our narrative of the rise of modernity is if it's looked at in the global, as a global phenomenon. And let me just say a few words about how different it looks. I'll begin with the obvious point, which will be obvious just because I've been repeating it before. I think we're going to have to drop that term, modernity. I just think it makes no sense outside of an imperial claim. What you are seeing rather is a whole set of things very comparable to the question of why do empires start emerging in the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE. A very comparable set of questions, but then what you're saying is what has been going on in China and India and Central Asia is directly related to what has been going on in Europe. Then you're forced to rethink this entire narrative that pushes everything else aside as being traditional. And you're forced to see all of these as interrelated. And you're forced to rethink the so-called modern period as that rare moment when one piece of the globe, namely those places in the far western end of Eurasia, were able to imperially take over most of the rest of it, an era that I think probably in your lifetimes you will see come to an end, with radical implications. When that happens, I think it's a when, not an if, again, all of our modernity narratives by definition will have been proven silly. But we also will not be prepared to deal with the implications. Simply one imperial world dying, being replaced by another one, is not in itself going to lead to any more complex modes of thinking. But it could if we start right now beginning to rethink our conceptions of the world. Because however things are going to play out over the next, say, century to come, whether it's going to be the rise of a new grand empire in Eastern Eurasia, a devastation because of the climate, some dramatic combination of all of these, and we can list all the other possibilities, regardless, I think it will become painfully clear to people, say, living a century from now, that our grand theories of modernity and those entire narratives based upon them were, again, kind of like those inscriptions of the first emperor that I mentioned, that are obviously what they are. They're simply imperial claims of legitimation. I think in a century that's going to be painfully clear to everyone. But again, we're not going to be ready, and we certainly will not be training future generations to be ready for whatever is going to be facing them if we're simply repeating those narratives to them and the disciplinary assumptions that those narratives build in. What we need to do right now, in terms of our research, in terms of our education, in terms of our public outreach, is beginning to train people to start thinking outside of that narrative. We need right now to start building cosmopolitan theories that take cultures from around the world truly seriously, that are fundamentally comparative at their basis. We need to rethink the entire paradigm of history and make it explicitly connective and rethink world history accordingly so that we will be trained to be ready for dealing with whatever problems are going to be emerging over the next century. And we need to do that, well, kind of now, because the implications of however things are going to be working out are likely to be incredibly dire if we are not training ourselves and training the next generations to come to rethink everything. So, these are grand pronouncements. How would I propose we do these grand thinkings of the disciplines, etc.? Well, I'd recommend beginning with some pretty basic things that I've mentioned in passing, and here at Warwick are actively being done, but I'm sad to say the rest of you, they're not being done outside of Warwick. Imagine if we started teaching our classes, say, let's begin with the obvious example, our history classes, connected from day one. Like, we didn't train students to say, okay, to think in terms of, okay, you have the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period, and then these other traditional societies that are, at some point, hopefully for them, going to become modern someday, as side notes to that. Suppose we just started teaching our classes as connective classes from day one. And there are very few people, Mike Scott is the rare example of someone who can, but most of us can't do this. Fine, we team teach. Fine. What if that's just the standard class that people begin taking? What if we start creating basic textbooks that will be out there? So when students throughout the world are learning basic history in the K through 12, well before they get to college, that's how they're learning history. It changes everything. And again, what happens when we turn to those disciplines if we're doing the same thing? And you might think, okay, but how do we bring in Sanskrit and Semitic theories of the economy? Well, the way we do it is very straightforward. We begin with collaborative research. That collaborative research begins developing basic textbooks that starts laying out these ideas and translating the works. Those works are then put into textbooks that are then distributed in K through 12 and college classes, worked up in terms of increasing levels of sophistication. So if you're an economics major, you'll be learning them intensely. If you're learning them in high school, you'll be learning them at a different level. But the materials can simply be created. And you simply train the next generation of teachers to think in a cosmopolitan global way. You create the materials in which it's just readily available, and the students are trained from day one that this is economic theory. You look at economic theory from around the world. You look at political theory from around the world. History consists of these connections throughout the world. And that is how they're being trained from day one. And then whatever problems they are going to face, note you have trained them to be able to begin wrestling with them. If you face, as we will, another enormous economic crisis, the debate isn't simply between rational choice theory and behavioral economics. You actually have tons of economic theories to wrestle with, thinking, oh, maybe we were wrong to assume this. Maybe we were wrong to assume this about the state. Maybe we were wrong to assume this about the individual. And look at what they did in 1430 in the eastern end of Eurasia when a comparable problem emerged. It changes everything. And again, this is not being presented as a stunning, radical rethinking. Imagine this is just built into our curricula. This is simply how we start training the next generations to think. If there's anything to this, let me emphasize strongly, yes, this will seem like a lot of work, but it's perfectly doable work. The only reason we're not doing it is simply we don't think this way. We don't think it's important to learn from so-called traditional societies. Take away that term, and everything changes. And if we started doing this, just rethinking our histories from a connective way, rethinking our basic theoretical edifice from a comparative way, creating the basic translations and textbooks out there that students would be trained to think this way, then it changes everything. And if you're a rational choice theorist, great, but you will know the counter-arguments that have been made, and you'll have to hone your theories in response to them. And you'll have students who will be trained to think in different ways, and again, it will, if anything, make better rational choice theory. And it'll say, we'll also bring up lots of questions about rational choice theory, and I would expand the point. So let me simply conclude by drawing out the full implications, as if this isn't obvious already, but the full implications therefore being the following. When we talk about what's the point of cultural comparison, the point would be, imagine a world where that wasn't an issue. Imagine a world where, by definition, you would always be thinking comparatively, globally, in connected ways, and that was just the level of knowledge. That would not require a lecture saying, we need to do this. That would be the way we would think. And if we did that, we would no longer have that chilling parallel with the first emperor of China who burned the books of everything that came before him. Imagine a world where we just took for granted if great thinkers, and there have been a lot, and extraordinary figures and extraordinary communities have wrestled with issues, we're going to take them seriously, we will bring them into the classroom, and we'll begin to rethink the world around us based upon that extraordinary history that we do have access to, because luckily we haven't literally burned the books, we just refuse to take them seriously, and it changes absolutely everything. Were we to do this, I think that next generation coming up would think radically differently. They would be trained to think in incredibly complex ways, and yes, I do think they would be, if not prepared to meet any challenge, whoever would be, but certainly incomparably better prepared than the way we are currently training them, which is, let's be honest, dangerously ethnocentric, dangerously imperialistic, and even worse, usually being done by people who would not harbor any imperialistic notions or any ethnocentric values, and yet if our disciplines embed those, that is implicitly what we end up teaching that next generation anyway. In short, I think the work in front of us is huge, but doable, frankly, very exciting, and would change, I think, for all of us, most definitely those including those actively doing it, change everything in an extraordinarily exciting way. Thank you so much.